Okay.
So I've decided, Sharon, I'm not going to go to the Ukraine.
You're not going to go?
I'm not going to go because I think I'm walking into a group of people that are enemies of the president.
Well, this is some breaking news. Just moments ago, Rudy Giuliani said that he will not be traveling to Ukraine after all. The New York Times had first reported that Giuliani was planning to push that country's new president to move forward with investigations that could be useful to his client, the president. Quote, one is the origin of the special counsel's investigation into Russia's interference in the 2016 election. The other is the involvement of former Vice President Joseph R. Biden's son in a gas company owned by a Ukrainian oligarch. Still with us, Jonathan Allen, Donnie Deutsch, Barbara McQuaid, Paul Butler. Paul, let me just start with you. Last night, around this time, we were all digesting the news that Rudy Giuliani was publicly saying he was going to Ukraine, and he said, I'm not going there to meddle in an election, but I'm going there to meddle in an investigation. He used those words. He said, meddle in an investigation that might be useful to my client. That is the president of the United States, Donald Trump. Now, 24 hours later, there's been considerable criticism of that today. He says he's not going. Let me ask you the bottom line legal question first. Were there legal concerns that were raised by what Giuliani said 24 hours ago?
So meddling in an investigation would be a crime if he did it in the United States. Again, that's what President Trump most likely did. Here in the Ukraine, once again, Steve, criminal law adjacent, a gutsy prosecutor might be able to bring a case for some kind of campaign finance violation or maybe Logan Act. It's far from a slam dunk. You know, when I was a prosecutor, one of the things I learned were that lots of acts of corruption weren't necessarily criminal per se. With this administration, we see acts that are so brazen, they're un-American, they're against all kind of democratic norms, but they don't necessarily cross the line to being criminal law issues.
Donnie, last night, again, when you had Giuliani's original statement there, I think one of the things that shocked people beyond all of the specifics was the brazenness of it. Was the attorney for the president who's just gone through this 2-year investigation where all of these suggestions were out there, you know, coordination, cooperation. There were extreme suggestions that were out there and then saying he's going to go over to a foreign country and try to get them to pursue an investigation that might turn up information that would be useful. For Giuliani to say that publicly in the first place.
It's a sick, twisted, evil judo move. It's the Trump thing. Well, if I keep doing it, it's not wrong. I wouldn't be doing it in public. Just a side note on Giuliani. I'm a little bit older than you. I was here when Giuliani was running the city. He was a great mayor at one point. And then after he left office, so many people who lived in the city felt he was almost exploiting 9/11, and he went from there. He has become such a despicable figure, such a tragic old man doing anything to stay relevant. What a disappointing, sad little old man that has taken on such a dastardly, evil, twisted manner that he would display this in the last 24 hours, which was probably just a publicity stunt in the first place. But of all the president's men, of all these swamp things, Rudy Giuliani stands out to me of the lowest of the low.
And again, Giuliani's just saying this in the last couple of minutes on Fox that he won't go. Let's play just a little bit more, give you a sense of what he is saying now.
Okay, so no trip on Sunday, no trips to Ukraine.
No trips because I believe I was walking into a bunch of people, one of whom already has been found to be involved in this that I wasn't aware of. And I think this was a setup.
Okay, again, that was Giuliani just a couple of minutes ago. Also, again, this was just a couple of hours ago. The president speaking to Politico, Donald Trump saying tonight to Politico, again, before Giuliani just said what we showed you, he said that he planned to speak to Giuliani before his trip to Ukraine. I plan to speak to him about it before he leaves. I'm just curious about that. That was what Trump said tonight. He said he had not spoken to Giuliani at any great length about this. John, I do think there's been a pattern here just the last couple of years with Rudy Giuliani making pronouncements that you get the impression surprise even people around Trump himself. This looks like it might be another example of that.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the backstory is here, Steve. I spoke at length with Rudy Giuliani this week, not specifically about his trip to Ukraine, or I would have reported it first. But there's absolutely an interest in the part of the president and his allies in trying to figure out if there's something that they can produce that will show that they were the victims of being railroaded by some deep state conspiracy within the Obama administration. I mean, that's still something that's hot on their minds. And so if Rudy Giuliani believed that he could get something out of a Ukrainian investigation that would produce that, no wonder he would want to go over there and do that. But what he said just there on Fox News, that he was going to be set up, I'm curious to know what the rest of that was. It sounds like maybe he was the victim of some sort of ruse or something. I mean, I really want to know what happened, and maybe some of us will inquire about that going forward. It's not surprising that the president or folks around him would reach out to a foreign power. The president won his election last time with the assistance of Russia, as Robert Mueller laid out in his report. And rather than having compunction about that, that seems to be something that they're looking forward to in 2020 as well.
Yeah, and Barbara, I guess Paul addressed the basic sort of legal question there of making this kind of a trip and then making that kind of request on the trip in the first place. I imagine, though, if Giuliani were still to go forward with this, maybe he reverses himself again, or at least when he was considering this, there would also be, I can imagine, any number of unpredictable factors and potential risks of what might come from that.
Yeah, this to me really demonstrates what we have seen again and again with President Trump, his inability or even refusal to draw lines between what is in his personal interest and what is in the nation's best interest. Our country does work with foreign governments from time to time in Ukraine. I know we've done work on rule of law there and helping them with anti-corruption matters. And that is done in the interest of our country, the United States of America, to help a country in ways that are mutually beneficial. Instead, what Rudy Giuliani is doing is going on behalf of President Trump as his personal lawyer to benefit his campaign. Now, when someone is coming as the representative of Donald Trump, I'm sure to those in Ukraine, they see him as the representative of the president, and they're inclined to give him what he wants and to help him. And so in this way, the president is really utilizing his role, his office of the presidency, to gain improper things for himself personally. And so just another example of those blurred lines that should be very solid lines.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.